David Hudson had never considered himself a man built for conflict. His entire life had been a steady pursuit of order, of quiet work done in libraries, archives, and back rooms where the only company was the smell of old paper and the soft scratching of pencil notes. He thrived in silence and routine, never searching for the spotlight and never inviting unnecessary attention. When his father passed away and left him the modest suburban house with its sprawling front yard and an old Ford truck that had been parked in nearly the same spot for decades, David regarded it not simply as an inheritance, but as the continuation of a legacy, a kind of stability that he, as a solitary and methodical man, valued above all else. The house itself was not large or grand, but it stood on solid ground, surrounded by a generous patch of land that gave him the sense of privacy he needed. For David, that open space was as important as the four walls he slept within. It was where he could breathe without feeling observed, where he could tinker with the truck that had carried his father to work for years, and where he could plant a few rows of apple trees without anyone telling him they were too close to a property line or too messy for a suburban neighborhood. He had not moved into the house looking for confrontation with neighbors or entanglements with community rules. In fact, David believed he had found the perfect balance between solitude and civilization. The neighborhood was calm, filled with manicured lawns and tidy porches, but not suffocatingly social. People exchanged polite nods, sometimes a greeting, but rarely more than that, and it suited him well. He thought he had secured a quiet corner of the world where his days could be predictable and untroubled. He worked from home more often than not, handling old documents for a historical society, and his pleasures were modest: an evening walk under the dim streetlights, a cup of strong tea while reading, and the occasional drive in the Ford, which he kept. In running condition more out of sentiment than necessity. That truck, sitting steadfastly in the dirt driveway just off the front porch, was more than a vehicle. It was a piece of his family's story, a constant reminder of the man who had raised him, and, in some strange way, it was a shield against the feeling of transience that had haunted David in earlier years, when he had drifted from one rented apartment to another. In the evenings, he often stood at the window, watching the quiet stillness of his yard, feeling the kind of security that comes not from locks or fences but from the certainty that the land was his, recorded in the deed with his name written plainly. Across it, sealed and stamped by the county office. It had been one of the first things he checked when the property became his, not because he distrusted anyone, but because documents were his world, and he understood the weight they carried. For David, a deed was more than paper. It was a voice carved into the legal foundation of society itself, an immovable declaration that this stretch of earth, this space of sky above, belonged to him and no other. He had taken comfort in that knowledge, believing it to be unshakable, as permanent as the ground itself. There was a ritual to his days that reflected this belief in permanence. Every morning he brewed the same brand of coffee, read through correspondence while seated at the same wooden table, then went outside to check on the truck, adjusting small things here and there, tightening a bolt, cleaning dust from the dashboard, listening to the old engine cough and settle into its familiar rhythm. The neighbors probably thought it eccentric that he cared so much about a relic, but to David, the Ford was part of the house, part of the soil itself. He parked it in the same spot where his father had, a place worn smooth by decades of weight, as natural as if the earth itself expected it. It never crossed his mind that anyone could question his right to park there. It was his yard, his land, his family's mark upon the neighborhood. And yet, beneath that quiet rhythm, there had always been something fragile about David's sense of safety, though he rarely admitted it to himself. It was not fear of crime or sudden misfortune, but rather an instinct he had carried since childhood, an awareness that stability was an illusion, that what appeared secure could shift without warning. That instinct was why he kept every receipt, every bill, every piece of correspondence carefully filed in his office. He trusted paper because paper did not lie unless someone forced it to. He had built his life on the idea that if everything was properly documented, properly preserved, then chaos could be held at bay. It was an archivist's faith, a belief in the permanence of ink and the honesty of records. In the small hours of the night, when the neighborhood was still and the only sound was the rustling of leaves against the siding of the house, David sometimes wondered whether he had isolated himself too much, whether his devotion to silence had left him vulnerable. But he always dismissed those thoughts quickly. He had the deed, he had the land, and he had no quarrel with anyone. That was supposed to be enough. What he could not know, as he carefully folded the day's letters and placed them in his filing cabinet, was that this belief in the immovability of documents, this trust in the shield of legality, was about to be tested in a way that would threaten not only his property but his very sense of reality. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between an advertisement for roofing repairs and a thin magazine David had never subscribed to. Its envelope thicker than the usual notices and marked with a crest embossed in blue ink that caught his eye immediately, though at first he thought little of it beyond irritation at the unnecessary formality. He carried the mail inside, set the stack on the table, poured himself a cup of coffee, and only then slid a finger beneath the seal, expecting another routine update about landscaping guidelines or a reminder about neighborhood watch schedules, the kind of paper that usually went straight into a folder labeled Miscellaneous HOA. Instead, what unfolded before him was a letter whose tone was clipped and hostile, with each line heavy as if deliberately written to unsettle. The words announced, without any hint of hesitation, that he was in violation of community regulations for parking on common land and that fines had accrued to the astonishing sum of $15,000. His first reaction was disbelief so sharp it made him laugh aloud, a short sound that startled him in the silence of the kitchen, because the idea that the place where his father's truck had stood for decades, on soil that was marked clearly within. The boundaries of his deed could be declared common property seemed absurd beyond measure. Yet the letter did not treat it as absurd. It was formal, its language legalistic, citing bylaws by number and threatening escalation to civil court if payment was not received within 30 days. For a long moment he sat frozen, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers, the words refusing to settle into sense. He read it again and again, certain he must have misinterpreted some clause, that perhaps the letter had been misdelivered, intended for a neighbor. But his name was written at the top in precise black type, his address exact, the language unmistakably directed at him. The letter insisted that the driveway where the Ford was parked was not private at all, but part of an easement intended for shared use, a claim that struck him as both surreal and deeply insulting. His hands began to sweat as he folded the page back into the envelope and retrieved the deed from his office, a document he had read countless times before with the same reverence others might give to a family Bible. He spread it across the desk, tracing the boundary lines, comparing each number to what the letter alleged, and there was no doubt. The land was his, legally and without ambiguity. The realization that the association was not mistaken but lying, or at the very least deliberately twisting, made his chest tighten with a heat that was part outrage and part something colder, a creeping recognition that the battle was not about truth but about control. He considered calling the association immediately, demanding an explanation, but even as he reached for the phone he imagined the conversation, some indifferent manager insisting that their records were correct, advising him to seek legal counsel. If he disagreed, their voice flat and unmoved by his protests. Instead, he pushed the phone aside and walked out to the yard, needing to see the truck, the earth beneath it, the space that had suddenly been declared foreign. The morning light fell across the Ford's hood, highlighting the small dents his father had never bothered to fix, the scratches that told the story of years of use, and David felt a rush of loyalty so strong it made his throat ache. He stood there for a long time, staring at the ground as though expecting to see some invisible line drawn across it by unseen hands, but of course it was only grass and dirt. his grass and his dirt, unchanged and unthreatening. And yet, because of a single letter, the place felt different, contaminated by a sense of intrusion, as though someone had already stepped across the boundary with the arrogance of ownership. That night, he could not sleep. He lay awake, replaying the words, the threat of legal action circling in his mind, imagining worst-case scenarios. Courtrooms, lawyers he could not afford, neighbors whispering about the man who refused to follow the rules, the humiliation of being portrayed as reckless when he was nothing if not meticulous. He rose near midnight, went to his office, and pulled out every folder that contained the history of the property. Tax receipts, surveys, copies of correspondence, all neatly ordered over the years, all proving what he already knew. His land was not encumbered by easements or shared use. It was private as his own skin. Yet the thought that an organization with money, influence, and confidence could simply declare otherwise gnawed at him until the certainty itself began to wobble. What if they found some loophole? What if a forgotten clause in some long-ago agreement could be used to undermine him? The rational part of him knew it was improbable, but rationality was powerless against the image of himself standing in a courtroom while others in suits shook their heads and labeled him a violator. When dawn came, he left the documents scattered across the desk like a battlefield and went outside again, drawn to the yard as though the earth itself needed his presence to remain his. The neighborhood was waking, sprinklers hissing, garage doors opening, but he felt an invisible distance stretching between himself and everyone else, as though the letter had exiled him into some new category. Where yesterday he had been simply another quiet homeowner, today he was branded as a transgressor, someone to be judged and disciplined. He wondered whether his neighbors had received similar notices, or whether this was targeted, a deliberate singling out. As if to answer, he noticed the couple across the street glance toward his house longer than usual before turning quickly away, their avoidance sharpened by something that looked too much like knowledge. By evening, the anger that had been tangled with disbelief solidified into a hard knot of determination. He would not pay, could not pay, not simply because $15,000 was an impossible sum, but because to pay would mean accepting the lie that his own yard belonged to someone else. He remembered his father's voice, calm but unyielding, telling him as a boy that land was the one thing a man could hold against time, the one inheritance that could not be replaced once taken. Standing at the window, staring at the Ford's silhouette under the dim streetlight, David whispered aloud, though no one could hear, "This is mine." The words steadied him, though beneath the steadiness was the pulse of dread, for he knew this. Declaration was only the beginning of a conflict he had never wanted, but could no longer avoid. When David finally gathered the nerve to confront the association directly, he entered the small community office on the edge of the neighborhood with the certainty of a man clutching a stack of papers like armor, his deed and surveys neatly arranged. In a folder he had organized with the precision of a librarian cataloging rare manuscripts. The building itself was unremarkable, a converted storefront with blinds drawn half-closed as though secrecy were as important as sunlight, and inside the air carried the sterile chill of overused air conditioning. The receptionist, a woman whose expression barely shifted when he explained why he had come, told him curtly that the president of the HOA would see him, and within minutes he was escorted into a room that felt more like a lawyer's consultation chamber than a neighborhood office. There, seated at the head of a long, polished table, was Patricia Lamb, the president whose signature had appeared at the bottom of the letter. She was a woman in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in muted gray, her eyes sharp behind thin glasses, her smile controlled in the way of someone who viewed civility as a tactic rather than an instinct. David laid the deed on the table, spreading it open to the section that marked his boundary lines, and explained in careful but increasingly urgent words that the fine was a mistake, that the land in question was indisputably private, and that his father had parked on that very spot for decades without a single complaint. Patricia listened with an air of polite detachment, occasionally tapping her pen against the table as though to mark the passing of time. And when he finished, she did not even glance at the document. Instead, she said, in a voice so calm it bordered on contempt, that the board had already determined the area was subject to common use under revised guidelines, and that his arguments, however heartfelt, could not alter the rules adopted by majority. Vote. David's insistence that his deed was a legal document carrying more authority than a neighborhood guideline was met with a smile so faint it seemed designed to mock. "We follow procedure," she said, her tone smooth but cutting. "If you disagree, the courts are available to you. But while this matter is pending, the fines will continue to accrue." The words struck him harder than he expected. It was not simply the content which he had feared, but the absolute confidence with which she delivered them, as though his evidence, his heritage, his very reality had already been dismissed in a ledger somewhere and replaced with a new narrative. He argued further, pointing out specific clauses, but her response was always the same. The bylaws had been updated, the board had voted, his case was unfortunate but final. When he asked why the board had not consulted him, why no notice of such a drastic change had been sent, she replied that notices were posted on the community bulletin board months ago, as required, and that his absence from the meetings was not their responsibility. The implication hung heavy in the air, that his solitude, his preference for silence had left him vulnerable, and that vulnerability was now being used against him without apology. Leaving the office, he felt the strange vertigo of someone who had walked in carrying truth as a shield, only to find that truth itself could be ignored by those who preferred another version. The afternoon sun felt harsher than usual, the street emptier, and when he reached home the Ford seemed suddenly fragile, its presence like that of a witness waiting to be erased. Over the next days the pressure increased in ways small but relentless. A new notice arrived in his mailbox. This one marked "Second Warning," repeating the fine and adding a clause about potential legal costs. Flyers were slipped under his door reminding residents of their duty to comply with community standards. Neighbors who once offered brief nods now turned their eyes away, their silence heavier than accusation, as if by acknowledging him they risked drawing the same scrutiny onto themselves. At night, David imagined Patricia's thin smile, the way her words had carried the weight of inevitability, and he realized with a shiver that what unsettled him most was not the possibility of losing money, but the suggestion that his ownership, his very right to exist in his own yard, could be stripped away simply by the will of others. He had believed documents to be shields, but in that office, in the dismissive wave of her hand, he had seen how easily shields could be treated as paper. For the first time he felt not only anger but fear, the creeping suspicion that he was no longer facing a misunderstanding, but a system designed to crush resistance through attrition, a machine that counted on solitude and silence to ensure victory. His resolve hardened in proportion to the dread. If the board expected him to fold, to pay quietly and retreat, they had misjudged him. The archivist who had built his life on cataloging evidence would not surrender his land without a fight. Late one evening he sat at his desk, surrounded by maps, deeds, and surveyor's reports, the room illuminated only by the amber glow of a desk lamp, and whispered again the words he had spoken before. "This is mine." This time the words carried not only conviction but defiance, a vow that the escalation had begun, and that he would meet it with every scrap of proof he could summon, no matter the cost to his peace or his solitude. The breakthrough came not through a lawyer or a sudden revelation at a meeting, but through the instinct that had guided David's entire professional life, the belief that paper trails, if followed carefully enough, always revealed their secrets. After nights of restless pacing and days spent surrounded by stacks of documents in his study, he decided to broaden his search beyond his own files, beyond even the tidy folders his father had kept for decades, and into the labyrinth of public archives where mistakes were rarer because they were not controlled by neighborhood politics. The county records office was a place he knew well from his years of work, its rows of drawers and digital terminals humming with the quiet dignity of bureaucracy. And when he walked inside on a gray morning with his folder clutched under one arm, he felt an odd sense of returning to home ground, as though the fight that had dragged him unwillingly into public conflict could still be transformed into the kind of investigation at which he excelled. At the counter, he requested every plat map, deed transfer, and zoning amendment connected to his property for the last 40 years. And though the clerk raised an eyebrow at the breadth of the request, the authority of his tone and the clarity of his purpose carried weight. Hours later, he sat at a table with rolls of faded blueprints spread out before him, cross-referencing parcel numbers and surveyor's marks with a meticulous patience that would have exhausted most people. What emerged was both reassuring and deeply troubling. The earliest maps confirmed without doubt that the land in front of his house, including the very patch where the Ford had rested since before his adolescence, was part of the property, drawn in, neat black lines with no indication of shared use. But several years later, a different version of the map appeared, one that introduced a faint gray shading across his driveway and labeled it community easement, a designation that had never been recorded on his deed, nor approved through any official rezoning process he could trace. It was the kind of inconsistency that would have been dismissed by most as clerical error, but David knew better. He had spent too many years sifting through historical records not to recognize the deliberate hand of alteration. The font of the label was slightly different, the ink density inconsistent with the rest of the print, as though someone had introduced the change with a different plate or a later reproduction. He requested to see the original entry in the county's logbook and was led to a back room where oversized volumes lined the shelves. When he turned to the relevant year, his suspicion hardened into certainty. There was no notation of an easement, no amendment filed, no vote recorded. The map that the HOA now brandished as evidence had been smuggled into circulation without legal foundation, an invention disguised as fact. The discovery left him both triumphant and uneasy. Triumph, because he finally held the proof that the association's narrative was built on fabrication. Unease, because it meant someone had intentionally created the false record, and that kind of manipulation was not the work of accident, but of strategy. As he walked back to his car with copies of the genuine documents tucked carefully under his arm, he could not shake the image of Patricia's calm, unflinching gaze at their meeting, the way she had spoken as though inevitability was on her side. Now he began to understand why. She had not merely relied on rules and votes, she had relied on a counterfeit reality crafted to make his protests look baseless. Back home, he spread the papers across his dining table until the wood was hidden beneath a patchwork of evidence. He compared the signatures, the seals, the numbering systems, and each difference was like a thread unraveling the tapestry of the HOA's authority. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt something approaching strength. Not because the danger had lessened, but because he could see a path forward that was not built on pleading, but on exposing. Still, the realization carried its own weight. If they had been willing to tamper with maps at the county level, how far would they go to protect the illusion? Who inside the system had lent them the access to alter records? That night he drafted a letter, not to the association but to an attorney he had found through quiet research, a woman named Lauren Reed, whose reputation in property disputes was both formidable and understated. He enclosed copies of the original deed, the altered map, and the logbook entries. And when they met in her office a week later, she listened with the steady patience of someone accustomed to untangling knots others believed impossible. "You have more than enough to challenge them," she said after scanning the documents, her tone both calm and edged with energy. "This isn't a matter of interpretation. This is evidence of fabrication. They're banking on intimidation, not law." Her words should have comforted him, but instead they deepened his awareness of the stakes. Fabrication was not a mistake, it was a crime, and crimes committed in daylight suggested a confidence that no one would dare oppose them. Together, they began to prepare a response, drafting a counterclaim that would not only contest the fine but accuse the association of overreach and misrepresentation. For David, it was a strange experience, sitting in a law office while someone else spoke with authority on his behalf. Yet he found that his own contributions were vital, his archivist's eye spotting small irregularities in the HOA's paperwork that might otherwise have been overlooked. The process gave him purpose, but it also heightened the tension of daily life. Notices continued to appear in his mailbox, each more insistent, each written in the same cold language of inevitability, and neighbors began to treat him with a mixture of avoidance and curiosity, as though he had become a character in some cautionary tale whispered over hedges and driveways. One evening, as he returned from the attorney's office with fresh copies of the counterclaim, he found a new sign staked into the strip of grass near his driveway, printed in bold red letters: "No parking, community access." The sight stopped him. Cold, his pulse thudding in his ears. For the sign was not merely an administrative gesture, it was a physical act of occupation, an assertion of control over the very earth he had just proven was his. He pulled it from the ground with both hands, the wood splintering as he wrenched it free and carried it inside where he dropped it against the wall like a captured enemy flag. In that moment, he understood that the conflict had shifted. It was no longer a matter of letters and fines, but of presence, of whose will would manifest in the physical space of the yard. That night, as he sat alone under the dim lamp with the stolen sign leaning against the wall and the Ford visible through the window, he felt the tension of the midpoint press upon him like a weight. He was no longer the man who had laughed at the absurdity of a letter. He was a man caught between the paper proof of his rights and the lived reality of an organization determined to erase those rights by sheer force of repetition. Yet, for all the dread, there was also a clarity sharper than he had ever known. He had found the first crack in their foundation, and if he pressed hard enough, the whole structure might collapse. The weeks that followed the discovery of the altered maps were marked by a steady tightening of the pressure, a creeping escalation that reminded David less of an honest dispute and more of a siege conducted with paperwork, insinuations, and quiet intimidation. Even as Lauren Reed filed the counterclaim and assured him that the evidence was solid enough to dismantle the HOA's assertions, the association seemed to redouble its efforts as though determined to demonstrate that legality was only one weapon. In their arsenal, and that control of perception, of atmosphere, of community sentiment was another just as powerful. Each day, new notices appeared, not only in his mailbox but pinned to the bulletin board outside the association office, where neighbors could read them. Formal announcements declaring that resident Hudson remains in violation of community regulations, and that fines continue to accumulate due to noncompliance. The language was sterile, yet the effect was corrosive, for it cast him publicly as a man unwilling to abide by collective rules, a figure of discord in a neighborhood that valued smooth appearances above all else. Neighbors began to act differently, though few spoke outright. Some crossed the street rather than pass by his house, their gazes flicking briefly to the Ford in the driveway before snapping away. Others lingered near their fences when he worked in the yard, whispering too low for him to hear but making no effort to hide their scrutiny. He could feel the weight of their silent judgment pressing on him like a physical presence, and he understood with growing unease that the association had shifted the battlefield from documents to the court of opinion, knowing that isolation could erode his strength as effectively as fines or threats. The tactics grew bolder. One afternoon, a man with a clipboard appeared in front of his property, measuring distances and photographing the driveway without acknowledging David's questions. When pressed, the man simply said he was a licensed inspector contracted by the HOA to verify compliance issues, before retreating to a car parked down the block. The photographs appeared days later as exhibits attached to a new letter that claimed his truck was causing aesthetic disruption and safety concerns, phrases so vague they bordered on satire yet carried the chill of official accusation. Lauren shook her head when she read the letter, assuring him it was a transparent attempt to pad their case. But David felt the violation keenly, as though the act of photographing his yard without consent had punctured the fragile boundary between his private refuge and the hostile world outside. At night, the sense of being watched deepened. Once, near midnight, he spotted a neighbor standing at the corner of the street, motionless, staring in the direction of his house before walking away when David stepped onto the porch. Another time, he found a flyer slipped beneath his door advertising a community petition to preserve shared access spaces, the language echoing word for word the false claim about his driveway. Whether the flyer was genuine or fabricated to rattle him, he could not tell, and that ambiguity gnawed at him more than certainty would have. It suggested that the association was willing to blur the line between official procedure and rumor, between governance and harassment. Still, the most chilling moment came when he returned home one evening to find a fresh set of surveyor's stakes driven into the grass near his driveway, each marked with bright orange tape. They stood like silent intruders, asserting a new boundary that excluded the patch of land where the Ford rested. There had been no notice, no explanation, just the silent proclamation of possession hammered into the soil. He pulled the stakes out with shaking hands, his fury momentarily overwhelming his fear, and threw them into the garage. But their absence did not erase the violation. The image of them lingered in his mind, glowing in memory even after they were gone. A reminder that the association was no longer content with letters and was now asserting physical dominance over his space. Lauren urged him to remain calm, to trust the legal process, but David could feel how the battle was shifting. It was no longer only about the law. It was about endurance, about whether he could withstand the steady drip of hostility designed to wear him down until surrender seemed easier than resistance. Each day he filed new evidence into his growing archive, documenting every letter, every photograph, every incursion, his office now resembling less a study than a war room. The Ford, once a symbol of quiet continuity, had become both the prize and the barricade, its presence in the driveway a daily act of defiance that he could not imagine relinquishing. One evening, as the sun slid low and the shadows lengthened across the yard, he stood beside the truck and touched its cool metal, realizing with a clarity that startled him that this fight was no longer just about property. It was about the very principle of whether an individual could be stripped of truth by the persistence of a lie, whether reality itself could be rewritten by those bold enough to act as though it already had been. The association believed they could outlast him, that solitude would crush his resolve, that isolation would sap his will. But in that moment, David knew that every new stake, every flyer, every photograph only deepened his resolve to press forward. The escalation had reached its second stage, and if the association wanted war of attrition, he was ready to answer it with the one weapon they had underestimated: his unyielding capacity to remember, to record, to refuse the erasure they so confidently pursued. The courtroom was smaller than David had imagined, more ordinary, with worn wooden benches and the faint smell of disinfectant lingering in the air. Yet, as he sat at the long table beside Lauren Reed, he felt the weight of the moment press on him with a gravity far greater than the size of the room. Across from them, Patricia Lamb and the HOA's attorney exuded calm confidence, their files stacked neatly, their posture suggesting not the anticipation of defense, but the certainty of victory, as though the outcome had been determined long before the first word would be spoken. The judge entered, robes swaying slightly, and after the formalities, the HOA's attorney launched into an opening statement that was polished, rehearsed, and laced with the quiet menace of authority. He spoke of community integrity, of the need for uniformity, of the dangers posed by residents who refused to comply with established rules, and when he gestured toward David with a subtle sweep of his hand, it felt less like a legal argument and more like a public shaming, as though the very act of sitting there proved his guilt. The exhibits presented were familiar to David because they had been thrust at him in letter after letter: photographs of his truck parked on the disputed ground, copies of the association's bylaws, and most damningly the map marked with the gray shading that labeled the driveway as an easement. The attorney displayed it with a flourish, speaking of it as though it were irrefutable scripture, and when he placed it before the judge he did so with the confidence of a man who believed paper itself would seal the case. For a brief moment David felt a cold flicker of doubt, the memory of Patricia's unwavering smile returning with a force that made his chest tighten. What if the judge chose to believe the association's version? Not because it was true, but because it was easier to accept the authority of an institution than the defiance of a solitary homeowner. Then it was Lauren's turn, and the calm precision of her voice cut through the tension like a blade honed by years of practice. She began not with rhetoric, but with the deed itself, sliding the original across the table with deliberate care, pointing out the clear boundaries and the absence of any notation of shared use. From there she laid out the evidence in escalating order, methodical as a surgeon exposing layer after layer: the early maps that matched the deed, the county logbook with no record of amendment, and finally the suspiciously altered version that the association now presented as fact. She did not accuse, not at first, but asked the judge to observe the differences in font, in ink density, in formatting, each detail accumulating until the conclusion became inescapable. When she finally used the word fabrication, her voice carried a quiet force that silenced the shuffling of papers in the room. David watched Patricia closely during this presentation and saw, for the first time, the faint crack in her mask. Her smile did not falter entirely, but her fingers tightened around her pen, tapping faster, betraying a flicker of nerves. The HOA's attorney tried to object, suggesting that the altered map was a legitimate update. But Lauren countered swiftly by producing the county clerk's notarized statement verifying that no such update had ever been recorded. The judge leaned forward, examining the documents with growing interest, and in that moment the balance shifted perceptibly, the atmosphere in the room changing as if a hidden weight had moved from one side of the scale to the other. When the judge spoke at last, his tone was measured but firm. He declared that the association had failed to substantiate its claims, that the evidence presented by the homeowner was not only convincing, but demonstrated deliberate misrepresentation on the part of the HOA. He ordered the fines nullified, the claim dismissed with prejudice, and further instructed that the matter of the altered documents be referred for potential criminal investigation. The words rang in David's ears like the toll of a bell, steady and undeniable. And though he sat still, his hands folded tightly in front of him, inside he felt the surge of relief and vindication rise with such intensity it nearly unsteadied him. As they left the courtroom, Patricia brushed past without a word, her eyes cold but her composure shaken, the veneer of inevitability finally stripped away. Neighbors who had come to watch whispered among themselves, their glances no longer carrying the weight of suspicion but of curiosity, even respect. For David, however, the victory was not about their opinions. It was about the simple recognition, spoken aloud in the authority of the court, that the ground beneath his feet was his, that truth had survived the assault of fabrication. And though the war was not entirely over, the investigation still loomed, and the association would not vanish overnight, this was the moment he had fought toward, the climax where the lie collapsed and reality reasserted itself with undeniable force. When David returned home after the trial, the house looked exactly as it had before, quiet, modest, unremarkable to anyone passing by. Yet to him, the sight of the familiar porch and the Ford resting in its place carried a new weight, as if the ground itself had been restored from some invisible occupation. The documents were still in his possession, folded neatly in the folder he had carried to court, but he no longer felt the need to clutch them like armor. Their authority had been recognized, their truth spoken aloud in a setting that even the association could not dismiss, and that recognition transformed the silence of his yard from a fragile shield into a fortress. In the following days, word spread quickly through the neighborhood, not through proclamations, but through the subtle shift of gazes and the tentative greetings of neighbors who had once turned away. They seemed to measure him differently now, not as the man in violation, but as the man who had stood against the board and prevailed. And while David did not crave their approval, he could not deny the faint relief of no longer being regarded as an outcast. The association itself retreated into uneasy quiet. Patricia Lamb, who had once presided with the assurance of inevitability, announced her temporary leave from the board, citing health concerns, though everyone knew the investigation into the fabricated documents had forced her hand. Notices stopped arriving in David's mailbox. The bulletin board remained free of his name, and the sign that had once been planted in his grass was never replaced. He moved through his days with the same routines as before: morning coffee, quiet work, evenings spent tending to the Ford, but each action now carried an undercurrent of defiance transformed into victory. Where once he had whispered to himself that the land was his, now he no longer needed to. The court had spoken, and the truth was written not only in ink but in the silence of neighbors who understood what had happened, and in the absence of further intrusion. One evening, as the light faded and the apple trees cast long shadows across the yard, he stood at the window and felt a calmness he had not known since the ordeal began. He realized then that the struggle had given him something he had never sought but perhaps always needed: the knowledge that his solitude was not weakness but strength, that his instinct to preserve, to document, to remember, had been the very tools that saved him. The land remained his, the truck remained in its place, and the quiet he cherished had returned, not as a fragile gift, but as something earned. And though he knew the world beyond his fence would never cease to test such truths, for this moment at least he stood secure, the keeper of his own ground, unshaken.